So please welcome Professor Richard Roll.
Good morning, everybody, and thank you, Jeff, for that introduction. And I also want to just add my thanks to Joel Stern and Stern Stewart and the other sponsors for inviting us to South Africa. We consider it a real privilege. We've been enjoying the country, and Joel, when he first invited me to talk about things on this in this conference, he asked me if I would say something about Merton Miller, who was one of the two co-authors of that famous 1958 paper that revolutionized finance. He asked me to do that because I was a Chicago student shortly after, a few years after that paper was published, and I was at Chicago because of Merton Miller. I had originally applied to the doctoral program at Chicago and was rejected. Fortunately, one of my professors in the MBA program at the University of Washington, a fellow named Bill Sharp, called up Mert and said, "Hey, you got to take this guy." So he said, "Okay." The admissions committee in those days to the doctoral program was rather informal, so my life was totally changed by Mert in that one instant when he decided to talk to me and to let me come to Chicago, where I met Myron and Mike Jensen and a bunch of other people such as Gene Fama, who have been very influential, I'd say critical, in the development of finance over the years. So my talk is going to be starting off remembering Mert and Franco, but of course, since I was in Chicago, I knew Franco, but not as well. Of course, both Franco and Mert are no longer with us except in spirit. So I wanted to reminisce a little bit about Mert, what kind of a person he was, and then talk about his career and the developments in finance that have progressed from his influence. So I'm going to start off by kind of some reminiscences and talking about Merton Miller in terms of a human being. He wasn't just a finance scholar. As you can see from this slide here, he was a very gifted storyteller. He had a tremendous sense of humor. He was an archaeologist. He explored places all over the world. He was a gourmet chef. He was a connoisseur of fine beer. And he was a farmer and an authority on American football. And he was a warrior who fought many battles in favor of free markets around the world and was very influential in that regard. He was a mentor to all of us and to many co-authors, and of course he was a scholar. So what I want to do is to talk about each one of those things to give you an idea of the kind of human being Merton Miller was, and I'm going to end up talking about the various scholarly influences that he had. First, let me talk about Mert as a raconteur. His classes were always full, because he would always tell great stories that were not only funny, but illustrated a principle. So one of the most famous quotes was that if you take money out of your right pocket and put it in your left pocket, you're no richer than when you began. I'm going to come back to that quote and show you why that's an important thing. To beat the market, you have to invest serious bucks finding information that no one else has. Banking is a disaster-prone 19th century technology. I think that quote, which is 20 years old now, is very pertinent to the situation today in the financial community around the world. He was also a very funny man. I'll tell you a story about something that he recounted to all of us back in the late 1950s. After his paper was published, he was invited to Germany to give a series of lectures on the cost of capital and leverage and valuation. In Germany in those days, there were not too many people in business schools that knew much about this modern revolution in finance. So he was asked to go to various places, and one place he was asked to go because they couldn't find any audience anywhere else was to the Bundeswehr War College in Hamburg, which was a place where they trained military officers in Germany. So Mert appeared, he was going to talk about leverage and the cost of capital. He appeared in the room, and there were military officers sitting in the front row, all in their uniforms, monocles, looking up at him. And he said he just couldn't resist it. He leaned over the microphone and he said, "Gentlemen, tomorrow morning we invade Poland." He was an archaeologist. He and his wife, Catherine Dusak Miller, they were just indefatigable travelers. They went to see every single thing in every place that they ever visited. I can recall many times, collapsing in the hotel bar and seeing Mert come in, dusty hat and everything, after having, climbed to these beehive houses in Anatolia, or the top of a mountain in Hawaii, or Masada in Israel, or places all over the world. They saw every archaeological site in every country they visited, and many times more than once. They were just tremendously interested in such a variety of things that it is really quite amazing. He was a gourmet chef. Andy Chen, who wrote a paper in the Pacific Basin Finance Journal in 2002, an issue that was devoted to remembering Mert, talked about how in 1976 at Ohio State, Merton showed up to give a seminar, but he also cooked that evening Chinese food at a house of one of the other professors, and he hand-carried the pot from the University of Chicago to Ohio State, in which he cooked lemon chicken. As Andy says in this slide, he says, "That's the best lemon chicken I have ever had." So you can see what a guy he was. Mert spent a good time in Belgium, where he savored the individualistic beer of that country. He loved Czech beer the best, though, because his wife Katie was of Czech descent. And according to Andy Chen, in that article that I just quoted earlier, it was his lemon chicken that made her fall in love with him. If he hadn't cooked that lemon chicken, he would have never been able to successfully woo her, but he did it with that recipe. He was a farmer for many, many years. Most weekends, when the Chicago Bears, which is, I don't know if all of you know, it's a professional football team in Chicago, Mert and Katie spent on their farm near Chicago. And his experience as a farmer piqued his interest in the futures markets in Chicago, where they trade futures on wheat and corn and things like that. And later in his career, he became a very important figure in these futures markets, and partly this was precipitated by his experience as a farmer. He was an authority on American football. He was a longtime season ticket holder with the Chicago Bears. Now, the Bears, unfortunately, play outside in the middle of winter. So the typical Bear game, it's snowing like crazy. The temperature is minus 15 degrees centigrade, and it's hard to believe that anybody goes there, but they get thousands and thousands of people to do that. Mert considered it a challenge to be able to sit in the stands and watch a game in the middle of a blizzard. But beyond that, one of the unusual things about Mert, all of us get invited to go give talks at other universities, and of course, most of us want to go to the most prestigious places, to Stanford and Harvard and places like that. And I noticed that Mert typically avoided those places. He did give seminars at MIT once in a while and so on, but he gave a lot more seminars at Alabama and Ohio State and Oklahoma, always on a football weekend. So you can see that that is one of the reasons that explains his unusual choice of places to present papers. He was a warrior. He fought constant battles in favor of free markets. He chaired a commission, a blue ribbon commission, after the after the 1987 crash, which wrote a report on the crash that I think was quite influential in keeping regulators and Congress and other government officials from imposing more restrictions on free markets. Of course, there's a temptation whenever something goes wrong to for the government to come along and impose additional impediments to the operation of free markets. And Mert was constantly fighting against the temptation to do that, even after traumatic events such as the post-'87 crash. I'm sure that if he were here and alive today, given the subprime mortgage situation and how that's affected the world's financial institutions, he'd be doing the same thing today. He'd be arguing against people imposing any additional restrictions on their activities and advocating basically allowing markets to operate as freely as possible. He often used keynote speeches at major assemblies of scholars to speak about these issues and to try to encourage the rest of us to get involved in the political aspects of keeping markets from being overly regulated. He was a mentor. There's an earlier generation of people, some of whom are here in this room, such as Michael Jensen and Myron, but also Gene Fama, Marshall Bloom, Sandy Grossman, Ray Ball, Phil Brown, Charles Upton, David Booth, Rex Sinkfield, and Joel Stern, and many others who were influenced by him as a mentor, including even persons not affiliated with Chicago, such as Joe Stiglitz, a Nobel Prize winner, and Renee Stoltz, another very well-known person, and many other people. And in later generations, I think it's safe to say that almost everybody who was a scholar in finance and published in the top journals were influenced by him, either directly from talking to him or indirectly through his previous papers. Myron, I think, captured his mentoring style perfectly. You see the quote here. Myron said that he has so many ideas. He was easily able to marry your ideas with his own, and new and exciting ideas followed one after the other. This was purely fun, invigorating, draining to some extent, but nevertheless an intoxicating experience. I felt the same way. Whenever I talked to Mert, I laughed a lot and learned a lot. He was truly tremendous. And let me turn now to his influence as a scholar. Of course, he had a long and distinguished career of original ideas, and you've heard a lot already about the famous 1958 M&M paper on the cost of capital and the value of the firm. Let me tell you about some of the other things, too, that he produced over his career. As you see from this slide, there were a variety of subjects which Mert tackled during his career. And in all of those cases, he wrote very influential papers. For instance, one of the key tools that we have in finance to analyze situations, which applies to many different models in finance, is the concept of arbitrage. And I think it's fair to say that although Mert didn't invent arbitrage as an analytic tool, he emphasized its use as an analytic tool, and I'm going to show you some examples of that, and was very influential in later papers by using that concept of arbitrage. Of course, he wrote on leverage. You already know that. He wrote on dividends, as Joel mentioned. His favorite paper was on dividends. He wrote on macroeconomics, and he wrote on efficient markets. He wrote and was influential in the derivatives world. He wrote on liquidity. He wrote on regulation, and this is not even an exhaustive list of things that he tackled in his career. So he was not only a deep thinker, but a very broad thinker as well. And you can kind of see that a little bit by his other activities, his non-scholarly activities. He was interested in just everything. Renee Stoltz, who is a well-known finance professor, in his keynote address in 2000 to the Financial Management Association, said that he would like to submit that it's the idea of arbitrage at the center of Mert's career and of his contributions to our field. The arbitrage mechanism is how Merton Miller thought about finance phenomena. Now, when we think about arbitrage, he used arbitrage for many purposes. For leverage, the 1958 paper, in fact, was a paper which said, if you have a firm that's got this particular leverage ratio, and you have another firm and it has a different leverage ratio, if one firm is worth more than the other firm, there's an arbitrage opportunity. So the implication of that is that arbitrageurs in the market would change the values of those firms in such a way that there would be an equilibrium where the two firms would not have different values. The same thing applies to dividends. For instance, if a firm pays a very high dividend payout ratio and another firm pays a very low dividend payout ratio, you can manufacture dividends on your own, like by selling stock, a little bit of shares of stock and so on. And the conclusion from that is that in a perfect market, where we don't have many taxes and things like that, it shouldn't matter what dividend policy is in terms of the valuation of a firm. And if firms had different values, arbitrageurs again would engage in that activity and make those values converge to each other. Of course, he applied this also to derivatives. His faith in this tool, I think, actually ensured the appearance of some of the most famous papers in finance. Myron's paper with Fisher Black, for which he won the Nobel Prize, Mert encouraged them very much in terms of the publication process for that paper. That paper also is based on an arbitrage argument that there has to be a relation between the option value and the underlying asset value in order to make sense. And if that arbitrage is effective, then you get a valuation tool to value the options. And of course, Myron will probably talk more about this later, but Mert, I mean, everybody knows that he had a lot of faith in this tool and a lot of faith in their model because of it. And it's a practical device too. Arbitrage is kind of the analytic apparatus that underlies a lot of modern investment practice, particularly things like hedge funds, because what a hedge fund does, after all, is look for valuation differences across different categories of assets or different individual assets, which shouldn't be there if arbitrage has been working properly. And so by taking a long position in the undervalued component and a short position in the overvalued component, you effectively move those things together, but at the same time, you can make a profit as a speculative tool, and you can do that in some cases without taking much risk. In fact, a pure arbitrage is what we call in financial economics is a situation where you guarantee yourself you're going to make money, you don't take any risk whatsoever. So obviously that's a very appealing thing for any practical trader to do. And by the way, it's also the underlying idea behind the arbitrage pricing theory, which is an asset pricing theory invented by Steve Ross, who you'll hear from tomorrow. The very title of the theory suggests the importance of this concept. I think that Mert had a tremendous influence on finance because of his faith in that tool. The 1958 M&M paper about leverage and valuation, it said, suppose we had an ideal world, perfect markets, no taxes, we can create homemade leverage. What that means is that if a company had, let's say, 50% debt and 50% equity and another had no debt, you could combine the second company with borrowing and create something that's very similar to the first company if the underlying assets were the same. And that arbitrage idea means that those two companies shouldn't have different valuations. So the implications of their paper was that the value of the firm should be independent of leverage. When we think about the value of the firm, we're talking about the combined value of the equity and debt of the firm. And the second implication of this, which is that the rate of return on equity should increase with leverage, because as you get more and more leverage, the riskiness of the equity component goes up, and it has to go up by a particular linear formula that was in their paper that shows what the rate of return has to be on the equity of a levered firm. So that was, when you read that paper, as Joel said, he recommends, and I do too recommend, it's a beautiful paper that was so pioneering because at the time, people didn't have a clue about how to do this. And yet when you look at their writing, and you look at the way they laid out the problem, it really is a beautiful result. How did Mert describe his M&M theory? Well, he said, people often ask me, can you summarize your theory quickly? And I say, well, you will understand the M&M theorem if you know that this is a joke. A pizza delivery man comes to Yogi Berra. Yogi Berra, by the way, is a baseball player. I don't know if you know that, but a baseball player that's known for his witticisms. A pizza man comes to Yogi Berra after the game and says, Yogi, how do you want this pizza cut, into quarters or eighths? And Yogi says, cut into 8 pieces, I'm feeling hungry tonight. So M&M says, how you cut up the pie, the total size, the amount of pizza that you have in the pie is independent of how you cut it up. And that's the essence of the M&M theory. And Mert continued, he said, the pizza stores, I often use this, and remember this thing, if you take your money out of one pocket and put it in the other pocket, you're no richer. So when they won the Nobel Prize, reporters came to Mert and he said, you mean something as obvious as that, they gave you a Nobel Prize for it? He says, yes, but we proved it rigorously. He goes on to say, actually, we did use a new form of rigorous proof known as an arbitrage proof. And as I mentioned before, that's become widely used in economics. The next thing that he looked at was the effect of taxes on leverage. And in their 1958 paper, actually, they did note that the tax rate on the tax deduction for corporate debt favored the debt, other things equal. And there was part of that paper had to do with how if you only consider corporate taxation and the deductibility of interest, it looks like that a more highly levered firm might actually be more valuable. So what keeps firms from going all the way to 100% leverage or really high leverage ratios? And later authors suggested that it was bankruptcy costs, that is the dead weight losses that a firm would have to pay if, in fact, it had so much leverage that if things turned out badly, it would have to go bankrupt and have to pay all these lawyers and courts and so on to unwind the firm. So there was a theory which said that firms don't have 100% leverage or very high leverage because of these bankruptcy costs. Mert was very skeptical of that theory. He didn't think bankruptcy costs were very important. And again, he told a story that I've printed up. He says, this theory looks suspiciously like the recipe for the fabled horse and rabbit stew, 1 horse and 1 rabbit. So his idea was that the bankruptcy costs are so minuscule compared to the tax benefit from the leverage that's not likely to be an explanation. And then in his presidential address to the American Financial Association in 1977, he kind of completed the model by including both corporate and personal taxes. And he showed that this creates an equilibrium where firm values do not depend on leverage after all. And again, arbitrage plays a role. If leverage mattered, an arbitrageur could create artificial leverage to gain money from engaging in that activity. I should mention that subsequent research about leverage built on M&M and on Miller's 77 paper, Jensen and Meckling, a famous paper about stockholder-bondholder conflict, and Mike's going to be here today, although I don't know whether he'll talk about that. Stu Myers, who's here, also wrote a very famous paper about the underinvestment problem, which is that equity issuance, so the issuance of more equity confers gains on bondholders. Those papers rely on incomplete contracting, which is probably realistic. It's very difficult to write contracts that cover every possible contingency. We probably will hear more about this. There were also empirical papers written following Modigliani and Miller. In fact, they tried to do some empirical work themselves, and there have been many papers over the 50 years since that have investigated the M&M propositions. For instance, leverage buyouts and other recapitalizations, which are ways that firms have of changing their leverage ratios very dramatically. Some people think that the reason that we have LBOs, and to some extent private equity today, is that there are tax savings that public firms aren't able to realize for some reason, and so they engage in these recapitalizations. Private equity, which has become so much more important in the last 2 decades, is, when you think about firms going private, agency problems, which were problems that were emphasized by Mike Jensen and Bill Meckling in their paper, private equity is one device which you might have to ease those agency problems to a certain extent. But again, that's a descendant of M&M. The actual practice of finance, such as in private equity, the idea of even doing that probably wouldn't have occurred to people if it hadn't been for M&M in 1958. We do see internationally, if we look across countries, that leverage differs systematically. Some countries, the average firms have higher leverages than other countries, and we may know something about that having to do with taxes, and we may not. I think that the scientific debate on this is not complete. But basically, the M&M proposition spawned research for 40 years. People such as me and others in the field, our whole careers are formed by trying to generalize and test the Miller-Modigliani propositions. Dividends in 1959 paper by M&M and a 1961 paper. Again, dividends are irrelevant because of arbitrage. Shareholders can create dividends by selling shares. Nobody can get cash. So if a firm doesn't want to pay any dividends, a shareholder can essentially get cash out of the firm by selling pro rata amounts of shares. You also have financial innovations which can arise to repackage dividends, such as special purpose funds and so on. Or they can repurchase shares or use cash the firms can, instead of paying a dividend, they can buy back shares, which in the effect on the cash flow is the same. So the ability to create dividends artificially kind of suggests through the arbitrage argument that dividend policy per se shouldn't matter very much. So one of my favorite and one of Mert's favorite anecdotes is about the dividend irrelevance proposition. Right after he published the paper, Merrill Lynch invited him to come to New York and explain to the management committee of Merrill Lynch why dividends were irrelevant. So he was writing on the blackboard, making his presentation, and somebody burst into the room and said that AT&T had just raised its dividend 10 cents, and everybody ran out of the room, leaving him alone at the blackboard. And 20 minutes later, the chairman of Merrill Lynch came back in the room with his colleagues and said, "Now, what were you saying about the dividends being irrelevant, Professor Miller?" And that led him to think about the dividend signaling hypothesis. So additional research about how dividend changes by firms can signal something about the future prospects of firms. And he wrote another famous paper on that. There were many later papers built on the M&M dividend paper. He wrote a paper with Myron Scholes about this shortly after the appearance of the original paper, and there was a debate in the literature about this, with Litzenberger and Ramaswamy being another well-known paper. And in practice, over the last 30 or 40 years or so, dividends have been disappearing, at least in the U.S. market. There's a well-known more recent paper by Fahm and French about disappearing dividends. What firms are doing instead of paying dividends is they're repurchasing shares. And that's consistent with, number one, a certain tax avoidance, taking advantage of a difference between taxation on dividends and capital gains. And at least one online encyclopedia I looked at recently says that Mert was actually responsible for the low dividend yield. So looking at encyclopedias, why do firms have low dividends? Because of Merton Miller, who wrote this paper. We do know that in dividends in other countries, the payout proportions depend on the relative tax rates of dividends and capital gains. We've had some experiments where countries have changed the dividend taxation policy, and you do get firms to respond to that. You know, basically what they're doing is just arbitraging the tax difference and so on. Well, you may not know this, but Miller also did work in macroeconomics. In fact, he wrote a classic text of macroeconomics in '74 with Charles Upton, and in that, in basically that textbook, which was very unusual at the time, because at the time Keynesian macroeconomics was really dominant, and it emphasized completely the opposite type of activity. There was no Keynesian economics in Miller and Upton's textbook. Bruce Grundy, another one of Mert's students who reviewed this in his life in a Journal of Finance in 2001, said, as the quote there shows, is one of the best treatments of public finance and the burden of the debt can be found in chapter 8 of that book. And what they did there is show that if you have the right kind of bequest motives and so on, that there is what's called a Ricardian equivalence, goes back to David Ricardo in the early 19th century, which that deficit financing should have no impact whatsoever on aggregate output. He was a huge fan of financial innovations in derivatives markets, and he said about Black-Scholes, I regard the Black-Scholes formula as one of the major intellectual breakthroughs of the latter part of the 20th century. It was not only an intellectual achievement, but it spawned a whole new industry. Their model was an amazing development because it is one of the few cases of finance where you can actually compute what a security is worth, not just in abstract terms, but in actual dollars. He wrote a bunch of papers on derivatives, but more importantly, he was a policy advisor in derivatives. He was a board member of the Chicago Board of Trade from '83 to '85, and he was a board member of the Chicago Mercantile Exchange for a decade from 1990 to 2000. And he was executive director of the CME-CBOT Committee on Joint Strategic Initiatives. So in the derivatives work that he did, he wrote scholarly articles on this, but he also did a lot of practical work getting the derivatives markets to broaden their scope. And as you know, in the time that he was working with the Chicago Board of Trade and the Chicago Mercantile Exchange, they pioneered financial futures and options and futures on a lot of things that had not been traditionally in their purview. And those financial futures and options have become by far the most liquid and broadly traded markets in the world, and we have them all over the world these days. Efficient markets, Mert believed that financial markets were pretty efficient, and when asked if he thought active management was worthwhile, he said not really. He didn't really believe it was worthwhile. In an oral history interview, which you can read online as part of the oral history that the American Finance Association has online, interviews with various Nobel Prize winners, he said that the sample is way too small to judge persistence in performance evaluation. In other words, to be able to tell luck from skill, you need a very large sample. And he tells the story of the bursar of Oxford whose members were complaining about low returns. He said, the bursar said, I admit our returns have been down recently, but you must remember that the last 200 years have been very unusual. Mert pointed to that as a sufficient sample to decide whether or not you could beat the market. He said the essence of efficient markets is, after all, there's no free lunch. And we all know how hard it is to beat markets. I mean, it's very difficult, no matter how much skill you have, to consistently do that. You might beat them for a while, and then suddenly things turn badly. One of my favorite and Mert's favorite sayings about the stock market, he says, we always know the stock price is wrong. It's either too high or too low. We just don't know which it is. And he acknowledged that markets are not strong form efficient by what that means is that all information is always in stock prices. He was a big fan of the paper by Grossman and Stiglitz that there are people with sufficient skills, they're inframarginal, that they can uncover information and cover their costs. Now, today, as a legacy of this work in efficient markets, we have behavioral finance, and behaviorists are always pointing to obvious mispricing, but it's usually the kind of mispricing that's impossible to arbitrage. So again, the arbitrage idea where you have behavioral finance people talking about stocks that own other stocks, and like and Royal Dutch Shell, which has listings in England and Amsterdam selling for different prices and so on. The problem with many of those examples is that it's hard for arbitrageurs, for various reasons, to make those prices come into alignment. Quantitative strategies that are employed by hedge funds are pretty good at picking up nickels in front of steamrollers, but eventually the steamroller gets them. But modern theory that's been developed since then suggests that there must be both active and passive investors. In other words, we can't have markets populated by all passive investors that are just buying index funds. On the other hand, if everybody was an active investor and expending resources and costs to uncover information, there would be too many people doing it, and there would be an advantage for a passive investor to enter that and not expend those costs. So what modern efficient market theory tells us is that we have to have a mixture of passive and active investors. And the equilibrium, the fraction that are doing active investing versus passive investing, depends on the costs of processing information and things like that. So, but basically the idea is that what an efficient market really is a market where at the margin it doesn't pay anyone who's an active investor to become passive or a passive investor to become active. So at that margin, the market is efficient. I already talked a little bit about derivatives. He was also a pioneer in liquidity. He wrote about it before it became popular. We had a tremendous increase lately in papers about liquidity. Mert and Sandy Grossman in '87 were one of the first authors to talk about this. And he also did a lot of work on actual practical work on helping liquidity in various markets, particularly after the Asian crisis in '97. Well, his legacy, if I quote Keynes, it says, "Men of affairs are dancing the scribbling of a few academic scholars from years back." And this describes Mert's influence perfectly, both directly from his own work and indirectly from those he mentored. No one has had a larger influence on financial thinking and practice. Every MBA, investment banker, central banker, corporate board member, whether they know it or not, are following some of his ideas. And we're not likely to see his like again. Thank you.